A ghostly story by Martin Payne. The night was a stormy one, in fact it was the windiest night of the year. The pony and trap came to a halt just after it had crossed over Derryleckagh Bridge. An elderly gentleman alighted from the trap. The youthful manner in which the old man was able to climb down from his former mode of transport belied the fact that he was well over his 70th year on this earth. With a single wave of his hand, the man, whose name was Patrick, dismissed both the horse-drawn carriage and James, its young driver, acknowledging the youth to make his own way home. The pony and jaunting car rattled off along the Ballyholand road towards Cave Hill and the crossroads, where was to be found young James's abode. Old Patrick pulled his overcoat tightly around himself and made his way up the hill on the Derryleckagh road and into the teeth of that howling wind. The old gentleman cut an unusual, if dare I say comical figure. With his hat pulled tightly down on his head and held in place against the wind by the simple expediency of placing his scarf across the hat and tying the said scarf in a knot under his chin. The time was about 10 o'clock. Patrick and his young friend had just returned from Hilltown, and after being dropped off at the bridge, Patrick would walk the rest of the way home, along the Derryleckagh road to Milltown, a distance of 2 miles or so. With his head bent low, Patrick struggled up the hill into the teeth of the gale. As the old gentleman labored valiantly against the elements, he thought back to the time only a few hours before, when over a glass or two of porter, his young companion and himself had struck a good bargain at Hilltown Fair. For one thing that could always be said of Patrick was that he was a good dealing man, especially if a glass or two of St. James Gate's best black was in the offering. 15 minutes later, the old gentleman was unceasingly battling onwards into the teeth of the howling wind. His old coat still remained firmly wrapped around him, the hat on his head was still secured in place by the clever utilization of his scarf. Patrick surveyed the hedgerows as he proceeded onwards. He glanced up at the violent storm-tossed sky and prayed a silent prayer for any poor soul at sea on a night such as this. 100 yards to his front, on the right-hand side of the road, was a laneway leading up to his neighbour's cottage. Patrick could make out the cottage sited at the top of the hill. He could also see the old beech tree alongside the little building. The tree was straining against the tempest wind, struggling relentlessly with the hostile environment. The old gentleman thought of the 2 young sisters who lived in the cottage, no doubt safely tucked up in bed, as they should be at this hour of night. To be out late on a night such as this was only for an old fool like himself. Patrick's thoughts then turned to the girl's mother Annie. Poor widowed Annie, he pondered. She died only last year, leaving her 2 teenage daughters to fend for themselves, but with the grace of God and the help of all their good neighbours those 2 young lasses should be fine. Further along the road on the left-hand side, just past the end of the lane leading up to the girl's cottage, was the old McKenna dwelling. It was a ramshackle old place, long since deserted. It stood now sad and forlorn, with sagging roof and crumbling walls. The empty window apertures gazed with sightless eyes onto a harsh, intolerant world. An old front door creaked and banged as its seized and rusted hinges fought a relentless battle against the storm. Many a haunted story emanated from that abandoned wreck of a building. In fact, most folk wouldn't approach it at night. It was said that years ago old McKenna cruelly murdered his wife and young daughter with an axe, and then afterwards hanged himself. The mother and daughter were buried in a nearby churchyard, but the local priest refused to bury the body of McKenna on consecrated ground. The remains of old McKenna was instead incarcerated in a salt marsh near Newry. The story had it that the priest said to the undertaker and driver of the horse-drawn hearse, "Remember, when you put a whip to those horses, don't let them stop until you get to the marshes. Because if they do stop, then the horses will never start again. There is evil in that corpse and those horses know it." When Patrick came as far along the road such as to be level with the abandoned McKenna house, he stopped suddenly. It was akin to a feeling that he had just walked into a brick wall. Patrick felt the sensation. It was almost as if he had just gripped the terminals of a powerful battery. The shock went right through him and a deathly cold permeated over his whole body. A movement to one side of the old house arrested his attention. A figure almost translucent in appearance was moving towards him. The spectre was covered from head to toe in a long white garment and seemed to float more than walk. Patrick knew instinctively that the apparition he was looking at was not of this earth. Although frightened, Patrick had the impression that he should have known who or what this phantom was. He even got the feeling that it did not mean him any harm. As he said a prayer to himself, Patrick slowly walked backwards away from the frightening spirit. As he moved backwards, the apparition kept the same distance from him, slowly advancing, almost as if it were trying to force him ever further back along the road. At the point where the road came to the junction with the lane leading to the cottage where the two young girls lived, the spirit quickly and silently moved to one side of the man, almost as if to force the old man back into the laneway. Without thinking, Patrick stumbled back into the lane. He was now trapped. There was nowhere for him to go now, except up the lane to the girls' cottage. "I can't go up to the cottage," thought Patrick, "not at this time of the night. I would be sure to frighten the life out of those poor young girls if I go and rap on their door at this unearthly hour." The old man came to a decision. That decision was that he would cease his backwards retreat and face up to this apparition. "What do you want of me?" questioned the gallant old gentleman. "I won't take another step back along this lane for you. I will not have those two young girls involved and frightened by this nonsense." At this point something strange came about. Patrick could hardly believe what his eyes were telling him. A strange metamorphosis was happening. The apparition seemed to dissolve and to change composition to that of a big white rabbit. The rabbit would run and jump at the man, and just as before it appeared to be trying to force him backwards up the lane. Patrick was still feeling frightened, even though a rabbit was not as menacing as the ghost-like spirit that had preceded its change of appearance. Because what the old man was witnessing on this dark and lonely country road was something that was clearly from beyond the grave. Patrick knew what he had to do, and that was to get out of this lane in which he was trapped and back onto the road to his home. What Patrick wasn't going to do was retreat back up the lane to rap on the door of the cottage in which the two girls lived, for that appeared to be what the spirit wanted him to do. Cupping his hands together and placing them around his eyes, just like the blinkers on a horse, Patrick, by this action, restricted his field of vision to a narrow area just around his feet. For what the crafty old man had come to realize was that if he didn't see the apparition, then its frightening effect on him was lessened to a marked degree. With his head bent low and his hands tunneling the vision of his eyes, Patrick moved forward in his renewed attempt to regain the road. The rabbit maintained its attempt to force the man back up the lane, but Patrick was determined not to let it succeed. Every time that the rabbit would drift into Patrick's field of vision, the effect would hit him like an electric shock, but the old man would simply rotate his head one way or the other, so throwing the apparition out of view momentarily. By the use of this unorthodox method, Patrick was able to regain the road and make his stumbling way towards home. Once the man had passed the old McKenna house, the sightings of the rabbit had lessened greatly and Patrick was able to relax a little. After another 100 yards he knew the apparition had gone. The old man could sense the change, but it would take another 100 yards of travel towards home before Patrick could bring himself to turn his head and look back. The wind still howled tempest-like. The McKenna house yet again cast its malignant presence by the roadside. In the distance atop the hill at the end of the lane, the old beech tree persisted in its struggle against the raging storm. Whilst down below under the green umbrella of that old tree, underneath its myriad of leaves and branches, seemingly safe within the walls of their cottage, two young girls slept blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded but a short time before. As Patrick continued along the road towards home, he kept pondering over in his mind the incident. He questioned of himself, did that occurrence really happen? Or did the porter he drank earlier that evening somehow affect his mind? No. I did see that apparition, though I can't help thinking that somehow I should have known who it was that was haunting me. The next morning, as Patrick sat at his kitchen table drinking a cup of tea, he was startled by a loud knocking on his front door. Upon opening the door, Patrick was confronted by a very distressed neighbor man. That unhappy neighbor was the bearer of terrible news. The news was that, sometime in the early hours of the morning, the old beech tree on the hill beside Annie's cottage had blown down on top of the cottage, killing the two girls asleep inside. To say that Patrick was shocked would have been an understatement. He was absolutely distraught upon hearing this terribly sad news. All of a sudden everything became crystal clear to Patrick. What he had seen the night before was the spirit of his dead neighbor Annie. The apparition that he perceived was simply trying to move him to go up the lane, and to awaken the two young girls by knocking on their front door. If Patrick had managed to awaken the girls, they would surely have invited him inside the cottage, put the kettle on for a cup of tea, and listened to the account of his ghostly encounter. Then afterwards, after Patrick had left and made his way home, the girls may not have gone straight back to bed. Instead, they may have sat on in their kitchen pondering over the night's events, and so with that very action they may have saved themselves from the fallen tree. Patrick came to realize that that was why the spirit took the outward appearance of a rabbit. It was because the spirit did not want to frighten the old man or distress him a great deal. Annie just wanted him to wake up her two daughters and so save them from their cruel destiny. But Patrick was much too stubborn and refused to comprehend, and by so doing he sealed the fate of those two young ladies. Patrick was to live for a substantial number of years after the events narrated here. It was said that he lived to an age of way over 104 years, but I would take that information with a pinch of salt. When Patrick did eventually pass on, it was because the hardy old gentleman died of a heart attack as he was boldly trying to remove the stump of a dead tree. This task was clearly too much for the tough old man to cope with. It would be ironic indeed if that dead tree stump happened to be the stump of a beech tree, though it was probably not. It would most likely have been a thorn bush. The White Rabbit was alleged to have made some selected appearances over the intervening years. But once again, I would also take that with a pinch of salt. It was most likely, as Patrick himself thought at the time, a bit too much use made of the St. James Gate black stuff. The old McKenna house endured for a long time after this story. It still cast its malignant presence over the local area for many years. Eventually it likewise disappeared from local folklore due to the ongoing march of time. Saddest of all is the story of Patrick's young friend James, the horse and trap driver. He was swept from this life at the early age of 32 years. Young James was reported missing, presumed dead after the ill-fated sinking of the White Star liner Titanic. Ironic indeed when we remember old Patrick's prayer on the night of the White Rabbit haunting. That prayer was for all who were at sea on a night such as this. That just about sums up the story of the Derryleckagh Ghost, or the White Rabbit haunting if you prefer. Strangely though, there is another macabre story about a gruesome murder and that killing's associated haunting in a laneway not many miles away. But that is for another time. By Martin Payne.